Mm, hello. Okay, we're going to deal with an imaginal construct called racism. Okay, and how racism um, is and its history has been used as an excuse for repeated bad behaviour and the continuation of racism in a different style. So the transmogrification of racism and sexism as imaginal constructs has meant that the way that it's been experienced or expressed by different groups throughout history has changed over the course of time, but it hasn't been eradicated. So let's have a look at this. Okay, so one of the unfortunate features of Australian history was that on the phenomenological, by the way, not the imaginal constructs, there were these places called the missions, um, whereby original peoples of Australia were taken from their families, typically if one of their parents was white and the other wasn't, but they were called a stolen generation. But there was also the missions, which was a way to segregate and separate the original peoples of Australia from the non-original peoples of Australia. So and so as a consequence, that was a type of apartheid. Okay, apartheid did exist in Australia as well, not just South Africa, not just the USA. Okay, but Australia. Okay, so Australia likes to parade itself as the land of the fair go, but if you're being honest, okay, that's not fair by anyone's standards. It's really not. It wasn't obviously. First of all, it wasn't fair on the original peoples because they were being treated like second class. They weren't even citizens sometimes. They were being treated as second class. They were being segregated. They weren't allowed to go into the shop. Things like that. Okay, it was curfews. It was not nice. Okay, they were separated from people were separated from their mothers. It was a cruel system. It was cruel. Um, and although the missions weren't everywhere, okay, they weren't everywhere. Um, um, it's so that means not everyone saw a mish. Not everyone lived in a town where they experienced black people not being allowed to go to shop the same as them, because not every town had a mish. There were missions all over the place. It was in fact a government policy system under the White Australia policy, but they weren't everywhere because Australia is a very large continent, and one of the things they were doing was taking people from their homelands and taking them to missions also that were at a distance from their homelands. So although there were missions that had people that were from that area, there were also people in missions who were not from that area, and so that sort of pain that caused the people who are affected by the mission system is difficult for them to let go of. Okay, because that brutality was systemic. Okay, it affected every part of their everyday life, and similar to the South Africans, it was a case of the white people were being treated better than the black people, and the black people were upset because why the fuck should they be maltreated in their own house? True story. Okay. No, it's like Zulus in South Africa. They kind of come from there. Can't be avoided. That's like the ancestry goes back like 200,000 years or something. Can't be avoided. Okay, that is their home. Okay, if a Zulu person went to Poland and lived there, well, they'd be the foreigner in Poland, wouldn't they? Okay, Zulu is one of the tribes of South Africa, isn't it? Well, they're not a fucking foreigner in South Africa. Oh, that's where they're from, right? So they're kind of like being mistreated in your own home type of logic is really um, kind of a thing. And moreover, being mistreated in your friend's home or your new relative's home as well, because the complexity of how people relate to land is little bit more than just your personal home is that whole territory. It's actually a shared communal thing. So anyway, with that, the apparently one of the benefits. This is going to sound terrible. One of the benefits of the mission system was allegedly, and allegedly is the correct word, not actually. Okay, allegedly, people were kept away from alcohol. Okay. Which means when they weren't allowed to go into the pub with the white fellas, they were kept away from a white fella problem, which is called alcoholism. Okay, so some people argue that since the mission system closed down and everyone was allowed to go to the pub, that's increased the rates of alcoholism, which is kind of not true. If you're being fair about it, although there would have been mission managers who tried to do the right thing by people and not act like total jerks, being in the same environment as them, and they've seen the humanity of the situation, try to be respectful. That might have happened too. Sometimes it probably did. There would have been other situations though where you would have had the kind of things that the Royal Commission into institutional abuse uncovered. It's amazing how often of those 4,444, which is a strange number to begin with, mostly men, as far as we know, that reported on the Vatican covering stuff up, experienced the abuse in a mission or an orphanage or something like that. How often did that happen? How often were they people who were Aboriginal men? We don't know. What we do know is that abusers like that don't know. They don't play favourites when it comes to that. It's they have their preferred targets because they are predatory bullies who select a preferred target type. So they typically fit a profile. Typically the profile seems to be associated with picking on the ones they perceive to be weak, the ones who are, it's almost a personality style type of thing, or like a trait rather, where they often the ones that they want to provoke and turn them dark, with anger and aggression, and so through the abuse, and so it's pretty sad that people went through that, and so the consequence was mission bad, white fella bad, fucking stuff like that. And other people responded differently and said, what, we're glad the mission system's over and stuff like that. Nonetheless, don't say white fella bad because, brown person, one of your ancestors was a white fella, and they took a more nuanced perspective and said, do you realise that means your white family lost a relative too, not just your black family, So there was war, everyone lost relations when that happened. It wasn't just black people, it was white people, okay? When the stolen generation came, okay, when those brown babies had both white and black ancestor, okay? The black ancestor was the one who was maltreated, the one who had the baby ripped from her arms, usually when it was a woman, right? Okay? And had the missions and all the cruelty of that, okay? The white one, okay, they didn't get to be parent either. They weren't allowed to either. Okay? They weren't allowed to. So it was a cruelty on both. And so what are the amazing features that have happened post segregation in Australia? And it's been about 50 years since post segregation. It's actually been close to 60 years since segregation ended. Is that it's still the case that people are trying to figure out who their relations are, and it's amazing how many people actually have an Aboriginal ancestor that they didn't know about, even if it was way back when, and just the one, or cousins, second cousins, third cousins, who were, people weren't allowed to talk to. The main thread that needs to be comprehended from basically the late 1800s to about, we'll say, the 1970s or 1980s, is called the "don't air your dirty laundry in case you get victim blamed" type of thing. So, with the Goldfields families that have Chinese and or Maori ancestry and or Aboriginal ancestry, some of those people didn't know that they had that in some cases, because there were murders and stuff like that, and you could get victim blamed and targeted if you said that that's what happened, So if someone lost a relation from a murder, they had to run away, and so their white wife could pretend their kids were white, and then that mean they never say they have any Maori or Chinese or whatever. Okay, so that all those cruelties just go, that's fucking toxic and negative, and all these people that are spoken about have the right to be angry, even at white men. Okay, the thing is white men in that story was only Anglo-Saxon men. Okay, he wasn't Irish man, he wasn't Italian man, he wasn't Maltese man, he wasn't Gypsy man, he wasn't Jew man. He was only Anglo-Saxon. He was only WASP. Casper WASP. Catholic Anglo-Saxon, or a Cas or a WASP. An Asper a Cas, sorry. What Anglo-Saxon is sort of like a weird strange, because what is the definition? Anglo-Saxon is the definition of white in that type of ideology. That in Finnish Nordic. But anyway, they sort of confusion like that. So there is a enormous amount of alcoholism in all ethnic groups in Australia. You'll find there's probably at least one alcoholic in every family. Alcoholism is classified almost as normal. Okay, and one of the things alcoholics do is they're known for a practice called vampirism. Okay, an alcoholic is a vampire who sits there and they feel sorry for themselves, usually through excuses, and has a defeatist amoral attitude, and then drowns their sorrows to cover up for the anxiety, and then goes and starts projecting all the entities that toxic attitude creates onto other people, and then uses them to steal energy from the people that they flicked it on. And a meth head does the same thing. A junkie, that's what junkies, meth heads, and alcoholics do. One of the things that they are known to do is to try and say that sober people who actually have a different attitude are like that when they're not. They're actually trying to stop it. Okay, it's not that they want for a good story either. Okay, some will respond to a good story. This is true, about how there is a lot of effort being put in by a lot of people to deal with whatever causes stress that they have, and whether they in a case of please don't assume that Aboriginal people are vampires. That's not what was meant by that. The point being tried to make is that most Aboriginal people are not alcoholics or junkies to start off with. They're just as likely as white people, okay, to have that problem. Okay? But if they do have that problem, they might well just be vampires just the same as a white person would if they did that. Okay? No, really, we're going to be fair about that, because it's about the attitude. It's about the belief. Now, the origin of the negative attitude and the belief, maybe with the Irish, is that it doesn't matter what they fucking do for 1,000 years, they're going to have different empires invading them. I mean, the Romans and the St. Patrick killed all their fucking druids, and then the Vikings kept doing raids on them, and they found a Dublin, but other than that, and then the Anglo-Saxons and whatever else, okay, the chronic warfare fucking situation, and then being under the yoke of the English aristocracy, to the point where they had a potato famine. Well, the potato famine was the salt in the wound of being completely ripped off for 1,000 years before that, and treated as literal fucking slaves by a foreign power called England, and then forcibly transported as a consequence. Okay? Without being rude and stuff like that, the trauma that affected Aboriginal people was extraordinary. It was terrifying. It's terrifying for those people. The indoctrination they had to do on Irish people, for them to turn a blind eye to that, was to be absolutely horrifying. It must have confused the shit out of them, because they literally came from a place, they arrived in Australia as a consequence of that. Right? It's not that. Sometimes it doesn't seem like, when you look at it like that, sometimes it doesn't seem like it's the black man that needs liberating, it's the white man. The white man needs liberating from the white man. And so the issue seems to be, there seems to be some black men who are seeing it as it's always the white man's fault. In that situation, it fucking wasn't it? Obviously. We're not saying it wasn't, because it was. How did they even get away with introducing an American style or South African style system in Australia, when the actual founding history involves 3 million mob, okay, several thousand Irish convicts, including some who were actually trying to kill the King of England and whose ancestors had been doing so for 1,000 years. Chinese people and Maoris. There isn't, but the Cornish and the Welsh, same fucking story. Same fucking story, but Scottish fucking liberation movement still exists. Sean Connery was part of it. Okay, this assumption that the quote unquote that fucking Hibernos, because they're all Hiberno names, Cornish, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, they're all Hiberno. Okay, they're not white. They're Spanish. They're Spanish and Minoan ethnically, and that means also that they're North African. Okay? No. Celtic people have their origins in Egypt. Okay? They're Egyptian. Okay? Right? Okay? They're Egyptian, Minoan, and Spanish, and Syrian. Okay, so like as in Assyria, with the A, when Syria had an A at the start of, okay, it goes back way back, 3,000 years ago to the Santorini explosion apparently. Okay, in other words, they're not white. Okay, they're not Swiss German, they're not German, they're not Nordic German. Okay, they are not white. Okay, they're not. Okay, go on, just ask the Anglo-Saxons. Ask the Anglo-Saxons about the history of the word fucking Hiberno. So here's how America screwed over Hiberno people in Australia, and therefore screwed over Aboriginal people as well. Here's how I'm going to say it, because you know for a damn fact that from your history books that the people that came to Australia first, from the Europeans, that is, okay, we already know the original peoples that really are the original peoples, okay, that's not in dispute. We're talking about when the Europeans showed up, okay. The people that came up were predominantly men and predominantly Hiberno. Even when they lived in England landscape, Cornish and Welsh is Hiberno ethnically, as well as in some cases a mixture of other things. Wait a minute, no, if you actually look at the people who were convicts versus the people who were settlers, you'll find the people who were convicts were predominantly Hiberno ethnicity, and people who became settlers who were economic refugees, for lack of a better word, due to the Industrial Revolution, but didn't make it to convict status, so they had a slightly better thing than that. Okay? Well, guess what? They came from the continent and were more similar to what the English aristocracy like to pretend it was before the von Battenberg's Saxe-Coburg line took over, which is they like to pretend that they were French. So when the Huguenots came over in the 1600s, okay, they were less hated. They opposed the papacy, so they were probably more likely to be a friend of the King of England or something like that. Okay, right? Okay, it was one of those things, and it was an ideological motive and political motive as well, because the King of England is a theocrat for the Anglican Church. Okay, so in the English monarchy, there is no separation of church and state. Okay, the King of England is a religious figure. So the Australian Constitution of 1901, which says that Australian society is to be secular, so it's got a secularity clause in there, okay, directly contradicts itself when referring to the English Crown or being part of the British Commonwealth. And that's a direct contradiction. You cannot be part of the British Commonwealth and be secular. So we've had this problematic debate in Australia as a consequence between what's called the monarchists and the Republicans, with the monarchists typically favouring a sort of a religious situation where Australia was founded as a Christian nation or something like that or whatever. Because so they're identifying with the King of England basically. It's really strange when they try and say Catholic, okay, because the King of England is not Catholic. The King of England became a theocrat because of King Henry VIII opposing Catholicism, or opposing the papacy, and founding his own version of Christianity called Anglicanism. And so if you support that model of the Federation in 1901, then the Christian component and the imperial component become entwined, and so the Crown becomes a theocrat whose job it is to, in the Christian tradition, proselytise and convert as many heathens as possible, because that's what that cult has codes in for, converting people. So imperial style, of course, would be to invade with your army and round some people up, and theocrat style would be to have them go to a mission and be forced to, pray to Jesus or something. Unsurprisingly, that's pretty much exactly what happened. With the Irish chieftains in old Ireland, with the Irish chieftains in the Druidic system or whatever, before St. Pat showed up, okay, you're talking about a situation where technically there was a bit of theocracy style stuff going on, because but not quite, because typically it's hard to describe. Typically, the way that church and state was separated, for lack of better language, is that the chieftain was regional. The regional chieftains came together as a council, It was independent from the Druidic Council, actually, because the chieftain councils were often warriors rather than mages. Actually, no, they weren't. It's even more complicated than that. That the chieftains had, independent of them, a warriors' council called which in English terms is called the King's Men. They weren't kings though, and they had a Druidic council, which is roughly the equivalent of the Grand Vizier. So they had basically three councils, three councils. The three arms of government, for lack of a better word, in an informal sort of regional setting. And so the warriors who were not the chieftains, okay, to make it clear, although chieftains often had warrior postures and were warriors in their own right, they had their own warrior class to support them, and a druidic class attacked as grand viziers, okay, which is a similar model of society that a lot of ancient ones in sort of Europe and Mesopotamia had anyway. It's quite similar, and the reason why it was like that is probably because they got the ideas from wherever they came from, okay? They weren't actually originally from Ireland at all, those people, are from Iberia, and before that other places that have already been mentioned. And so the way everything was done by descent. So if your dad was from the King's Men, the King's Guard, then that was your job too. If your dad was from was a druid, then you become a druid. If your dad was a chief, then you could become a chief. And so they just kept running it like that, and that's sort of like not that different from the aristocracy, in the sense that the English aristocracy, which is a different system again and has its origins in William the Conqueror, as well as the Romans, is basically like for the most part, in terms of how that system's structured, is also their peerage system is based on who your ancestors were. You can never get peerage and be part of the aristocracy unless you have aristocratic ancestry. So one of the things you'd probably find, and this is actually worth noting, is that the Musk and Trump family don't actually have that aristocratic peerage in their ancestry. Neither do a lot of those billionaires that they came from the merchant class that was created in the sort of Industrial Revolution, which is referred to by the term new money in Hollywood movies. Okay, the new money people is the Trumps and the Musks. Okay, and those people don't have aristocratic ancestry at all. They do, however, have ancestry that would have been mercantile class, and so throughout the Industrial Revolution, the 20th century, mercantile class was built up to become new ruling class, or to allege that it was new ruling class, because it's obviously the case that those who control your resources control your society more than anything else. So the mercantile class is actually distinct from the aristocracy. The aristocracy benefits from a mercantile class, but doesn't do that dirty work. Okay, so in actuality, the similarities of that particular social structure to ancient China are quite noteworthy. Allegedly, their emperors had mandate from heaven, but which is a variant of divine right of kings, and they were instructed, they reckon, to be the caregivers to the community, and they got their job from their dad before them, and so on and so forth. So, and in China, they had a class system as well, apparently, and they said the mercantile class was lower class than farmer. They actually put the farmers at the top, and then the emperors, and the merchants they put on the bottom, and there was some other class in the middle, possibly the religious or civil class. And so they said the farmers were at the top because the farmers were feeding the community, okay? So the farmers were afforded more respect in ancient China, and the merchants are less, because the merchants weren't doing the work and they were profiting off other people's labour, apparently, so they were at the bottom. okay? But the emperor was the caregiver, so he had higher status, okay? But everyone had to do something called filial piety, and which meant they had to obey the emperor, okay? Now that system, you might say, oh, fucking China sounds too authoritarian or whatever, but you're forgetting that that is in fact the English system. So that is the English system. That was the Roman system with the patricians and the plebeians. It is also the Vedic system of India. It is the same system. Okay, they've got different variations and stuff like that. So that of how that works. But what's happened, at least happened in the sort of Anglophone and continental Europe and United States sense, as a consequence of the American influence, the merchant class, and as well as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution more generally that's contributed to that, the merchant class took over influence from the aristocracy. And the aristocracy keeps trying to call back. The system treats kind of call back. So one of the things that happens is that sometimes merchants try to gain credibility by saying that they have aristocratic heritage. They don't. So Trump and Musk and people like that, they don't have aristocratic heritage. They don't qualify for peerage. There are even people who qualify for peerage who are very low rank, who you might actually find aren't particularly wealthy compared to what you would expect aristocrats to be as well, because that is a class system, not always an economic one. So that's something you need to take into consideration. The lowest ranking aristocrats are not rich. Because it is based on ancestry and peerage and stuff like that. You'd be surprised to know this physical body. If things hadn't changed in the 1600s, would actually be part of the French aristocracy. Okay, so this physical body has ancestry. He was from the French aristocracy. Okay, no, really. And so there were not all aristocrats decided to stay that way. Some rejected it and became Huguenots and stuff as well. That actually happened. Some weren't rich to begin with, and they came from a different class structure or whatever, like so different ranks within the aristocracy. But because aristocracy was the ruling class, so they had people who were low rank who did small jobs at the local level, which and they actually had to do those jobs. They were henchmen, and the aristocracy at the upper levels doesn't do any work at all and delegates and profits. So it's a trickle-up system, or a flood-up system, depending on how you look at it. And even amongst the aristocracy, the lowest ranks are sometimes quite poor. But they're never as poor as the plebeians or the working class proper, And then that system being put, you just might imagine that system being put on top of mob in Australia and stuff like that, or other groups whose cultures were quite distinct from that, might have been confusing to say the least, and disturbing. Very confusing and very disturbing for those people it would have been. And it was confusing and disturbing enough for the Europeans. They were actually trying to wrestle away from that pretty much the entire time. For almost the entire time that the Roman Empire was in charge of Europe, the predecessors to what's now the European countries, those tribes, people, and nations were killing every Roman they saw. It was actually the case that the Visigoths, Goths, and the what's now called the Jewish people from Judea and Galilee were working together to fight the Romans in the Jewish and the Hunnish and Visigoth rebellions did in fact have mutual cooperation sometimes. And the consequence was the creation of Christianity by Emperor Constantine to pretend that the Roman Empire had been defeated by creating a sort of some kind of logical framework where the populace was convinced that they'd been defeated. Okay, so it's a real the political game playing that Constantine did was nothing short of brilliant. Okay, as far as dictatorial theocratic behaviour is concerned, to try and put the seeds of imaginal constructs in the community to convince them, and these are all different language groups and whatever else as well, that they are not only defeated but they've also defeated their adversary, whilst that adversary has in fact gained more control than they've ever had before. Okay, is an absolute wow. There was some serious skill done in that. They were not stupid people. In terms of political strategy, the creation of Christianity was one of the most expedient forms of fascism that the world has ever seen, in terms of its efficient capability to both engage in the control through imaginal constructs, as well as gain political and economic control as a consequence, and to squash rebellion, whilst claiming that they supported it, was just extraordinary. And so from that sort of the best way to rebel is to roll over and die type of mindset. You start to get to the idea of what did Ashoka's Buddhist monks do when they left the Indus Valley around the same time that Constantine was creating Christianity. And the answer is that if you're in a state of void, you don't exist, which means you're liberated. Okay, listen to this language. If you don't exist, because you're in a state of void consciousness, you're liberated. So the path to liberation is snuffing out all non-existence. The best way to be liberated is to not exist. Take the middle path. Don't fight the adversaries or the injustices that you dislike, but have compassion for those that are suffering. There. Just accept life as samsara, suffering. There. That's alright, you poor fucking pledge. You piss squad telling him off too much. He doesn't like your aesthetic crap. Just deal with it. Yeah, the reason why you're fucking suffering is you're attached too much to the idea that you might ever get fucking justice. Gautama's gonna go home and fuck his pretty wife. Guess what he actually did. Anyway, so Ashoka was a very violent man who allegedly came to peace after he was covered in too much blood, and created a theocratic Ashokan empire based on Buddhism. And there were actually Buddhist emissaries that went to Turkey and Rome as intellectuals. So Buddhism was actually introduced to Europe during the time of Ashoka, and that was before Constantine. So there's some people argue that it was Buddhism, not the Essenes, that contributed to some of the ideas that led to Christianity, and specifically the ideas of roll over and die, just accept that life is hard, get over it. Here, there. Okay, which is very Christian. And are you feeling bad? Are you? Here, have some bread. Okay, so that's what Christianity does is it acts as an ideological dragnet to prevent people from engaging in true standing up against injustice. Okay, I've got people constantly paranoid and looking for an enemy, but not seeing the true nature of that enemy, and say and basically they turn around and they try and say anyone who's not part of their group is the enemy. Okay, and so they either have to convert them or they have to destroy them. Okay, and Christianity didn't invent that particular worldview, those particular imaginal constructs. Other societies did, and Buddhism contributed to that. Okay, through Ashoka, both Buddhism and Christianity in that respect are pretty bad. Of course, it is vitally important for Christians to never let go of their stodgy, patriarchal hatred, and how that was almost entirely crafted by the Roman emperors, and the Roman emperor named Constantine, who came from a long lineage of emperors who were in fact bloodthirsty and violent, who did in fact have a system called Pax Romana, from more or less the beginning, which was basically shake you down like the fucking mafia. You'll get peace if you do as you're told. Okay, the Roman peace. Do as you're told and you won't die. Oh, you give us what we want. You'll be at peace now. That's Pax Romana. Okay? This here is the Crux implant, okay? Right here, this knife here on the neck is the Crux implant. Okay? That is the cross. That is the Christian cross. The Christian cross is nothing more than a knife that Romans used to put to people's fucking neck. And then when that didn't work, they had them strung up to the crucifixion. Okay, that's called Pax Romana. You didn't give them what they wanted, therefore you're going to get strung. Christianity is a story about how everyone has the Spirit of Christ within them, and therefore if you don't fucking do what you're told, you're going to get strung. You're exactly like Jesus. You are Jesus. If you don't do what you're told when the Romans tell you, you're going to get crucified. Oh, you feel better, do you? Because there was a declaration of Jesus once you got crucified for you, so you don't have to be crucified no more? Ah, too bad. Now we have wheels to stretch you on, to stretch your limbs out in the medieval era, to torture you that way. Now we have the cat and nine tails. Now we have the gallows. Now we have the witch burnings. Okay? And then we had World War II, we had the gas chambers, and all kinds of things. So, at this point, when you look at history, it does make the Christians look pretty evil, actually. They look pretty bad. Okay? They're just an ideological, imaginal construct reframing of Roman aggression. It's not peaceful at all. And heck, the Buddhists look pretty dumb too. Or what the Buddhists trying to say? What, the emperor has to be peaceful as well? The emperor needs to roll over and accept that he might be suffering and he shouldn't take it on other people that have more compassion for his community. Yeah, have a demo wheel. like it's like but in turn the emperor can rip them off and cause them suffering. So this sort of this tacit acceptance of structural and social inequality that's endemic to religions, cults, and empires is noteworthy. And from that, you have a sidewinder where, because of the patronymical thing, there were people who were, they don't want that new invaders fucking cult, a new invaders version of the system, so they'll fight for their chieftains of old, and until the Poms are out and the Irish Republic's instated. So there's that too. Anyway, the problem with the Americans is quite enormous. The sort of karmic blowback that they're getting now is extreme. Okay, this is not judgment. This is action versus reaction, apparently. So, America for the last century or so, in particular, and before that, has done enormous amounts of actions with the expectation that there would be no reaction. And now they're getting a reaction. And it's not favourable to the United States of America. America is being shown for what it is. a fascist dictatorship where the merchant class wishes they were an aristocracy. A merchant class that puts himself in the position of theocrats and wishes they were the aristocracy. Okay, so it's not about the founding of America by the founding fathers was not about liberation from the English aristocracy. It was jealousy of the English aristocracy by the merchant class. Okay, now they're showing it. They're showing that they are a fascist dictatorship based on false expertise. The false expertise of junkies who steal ideas from other people. Okay? They are expressing exactly how a lot of quarters of the Western world thought them to be. They are openly living exactly what the rest of the world thought them to be, and their propaganda didn't let them see. Okay, American propaganda prevented America from seeing what it was. A country that had missions all over it, and then reservations. A country that whereby California and Texas originally belonged to the native Mexicans, or parts of it anyway. A country where New York State, or that sort of general area south of Ontario, was actually sort of the stomping ground of a tribe that's now in Ontario, where the borders were drastically freaking different. A country that got all of its wealth as ill-gotten gains from apartheid, both in its country and outside. Don't forget that Rudyard Kipling was an 18th century author of English extraction who was working with the Americans in California specifically. Inspired them to create a belief system called Manifest Destiny and White Man's Burden, which is a racial derivative of the noblesse oblige. So the obligation of the nobles or the aristocracy to go, there, you stupid unwashed plebs, you don't know anything. Okay? Called White Man's Burden. White Man's Burden is an extension of noblesse oblige for the manifest destiny of the United States of America. America's manifest destiny was to use the noblesse oblige of the merchant class to become the new aristocracy as a form of white man's burden to teach everyone else how they were there, including their own white people. Okay? So the sort of Stockholm syndrome like way that the imperial mindset of the USA is imprinted upon the plebeian class of the USA, namely the MAGAs. Okay, the MAGAs appear to be a group of plebeians that were taught the American dream, ironically by the Democrats, to worship the petit bourgeois ideals of economic success being equivalent with moral worth, because the aristocrats are of no moral value. They only got their wealth through ill-gotten gains by ripping off the plebeians, and under the iron yoke of the merchant class instead, thou shalt get a wage, dear serf, and all your ideas will be ripped off by the merchant class who wants to be the aristocracy, right? And so they get this sort of weird thing where they want to have the petit bourgeois ideal of material success to show their moral worth. The imaginal constructs, the symbolism associated with consumerism is almost always, you don't buy McDonald's, do you? You buy fun out with your teenage friends and popularity. you don't buy Mercedes-Benz. You buy the status of a middle-aged man who can pork a 25-year-old socialite anytime he likes. So you're not buying a car, you're not buying fast food, you're buying what it represents, okay? And so when they buy the American dream or American nightmare over there, they're buying not a house or a car or a credit card debt. They're buying the jealousy of the serf towards the merchant class who had more bargaining power to replace the aristocracy than they. Okay, they're buying jealousy. Okay, there's no one in the United States of America has ever owned a house. Okay, they've purchased jealousy. Okay, because if you look at the technicalities of each case, you'll probably find that none of the so-called treaties with the original peoples over there are valid anyway. And in the case of Australia, as far as we know, there are no treaties. Technically, there is no such thing as home ownership in the USA at all. There's just robber barons, as they call them, like Trump, who have made false claims to acting as a government agent for the purpose of buying and selling land or subdivisions on that land in the form of a tower. And having no legal authority to even build that tower in the first place, and even using capital that was derived apparently from the KGB, you can rest assured that every single Trump tower is actually against both the original law of that land, the whitefellow law of that land, as in the form of founding fathers, and, basically the common sense principles of not doing treason. Anyway, which apparently common sense. This sort of like assumption, this sort of the territorial assumptions that come with the idea of land and nation state are also what you might call imaginal constructs as well. Phenomenologically, you cannot occupy any more space than the spot your backside is actually sitting on. So phenomenologically, this physical body owns the chair because that's what they're sitting on. They're not carrying any other objects except this phone. So there's no phenomenologically owning anything. In sheer practice, someone could come and take any of the objects anytime, and it would be up to sheer capacity to use force of words or argument or trickery or sophistry with language in regards to the imaginal constructs of social customs and laws and whatever else, and whatever the beliefs that individual are, to convince them to not do that. Okay, so basically everything, science, politics, religion, is sophistry about wordplay to try and trick you into believing or not believing certain things. And that sophistry that they've put on the American people for however long now meant that when they sent their miners to Victoria, they were imprinted with white man's burden. They were imprinted with noblesse oblige and the manifest destiny. All those ideas that came from the Californian goldfields were taken to the Victorian ones. And so when the first Parliament of Australia was built in Melbourne, not far from the goldfields, there were people there who were mentally imprinted with those ideas. And that led to and contributed to, along with the influence of the British, to the founding of the White Australia policy in the first place. And so, as it turns out, the suffering of the Australian people was caused by the Poms and the Yanks. And when they act surprised that Australia goes, we're glad we're not England or America, Australia goes, we don't like England or America, we want them to go away. Don't be surprised if there's a reason for it. that has a phenomenological history that has been carried as imaginal constructs today. So, we're sorry, USA, suck shit. And as for England, you're next.